Well, you can always say that. As you say, it's perhaps I'll go with. Not definitely. I mean, in fact, I think it's a fine little album. I think the fact that it's got so much on it is one of the things that's cool about it. Because they're very varied stuff, Rocky Raccoon, Piggies, Happiness of Warm Guns, that kind of stuff, I think it's a fine album. I'm not a great one for that, maybe it was too many of that. Look, what do you mean? It was great, it's sold, it's the bloody Beatles White Album, shut up.
I think it's interesting when he talks about, just before he says that, I think the fact that it's so varied is what's cool about it.
Yeah.
And then he lists songs and he says, it's got Rocky, Piggies, and he sort of tries to remember, and then he says Happiness is a Warm Gun. And I do have to wonder whether or not he is deliberately choosing, a Paul song, a George song, a John song, which I think is really,
I think so,
very diplomatic of him in that moment to be doing that.
Yeah.
And also not what I would expect from George. When being asked to pick name 3 songs from the White Album.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily imagine he would be given that the same consideration.
Yeah, I mean, as we've seen earlier in this documentary, Paul is in conciliatory mode. He is, he's a sort of interesting character study in a sense, because you're watching a guy who is very aware that other people, mainly George, is going to see the interview he's doing. And so he is at pains to extend an olive branch wherever possible, So I think that's kind of what he's doing there. I really like that. It's the bloody Beatles White Album. Shut up. I've always found it really funny, and also he's right as well. I mean, I think it's one of those. I mean, whenever anyone says, "Oh, you'll see it on the internet every now and again," it's like, "Oh, if you were going to make the White Album into a single album, what songs would you remove?" I mean, personally, I think that wishing the Beatles' career and output to be anything other than what it was is just an odd exercise. I have no desire for it to, other than, it would have been nice if they'd gone on for a few more years or whatever, or stayed together in some capacity or got back together or whatever. Obviously that would have been lovely. Other than that, I can't imagine wanting it to be any different. The whole thing was just perfect as it was,